You could have been the person who delivered the newspaper to Epstein's office, and your name could very well be in the file.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. 6 years after his death in prison, convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein is dominating the news in Washington, D.C., due to his longtime friendship with President Trump. The story touches on QAnon and the deep state, the relationship between Trump and the MAGA movement, and the dynamics between the White House, DOJ, and FBI in the second Trump administration. While most news cycles in the Trump era had kind of a flashbang approach, this one has had remarkable staying power. And the legal logistics of it all are key to understanding where things are at. So what was the legal case against Epstein and his partner Ghislaine Maxwell? How have the FBI and DOJ handled questions around this case under Trump? And what is the legal standing of Trump's defamation lawsuit against the Rupert Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal? To discuss these questions, I'm delighted to welcome USSC Honorary Associate Dr. Harry Melkonian on the podcast. Harry is a legal educator and has extensive experience in practicing law in both the U.S. and Australia. And he also specializes in U.S. constitutional issues as well as media and defamation law. So very relevant to this discussion. Harry, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's nice to be with you, Marie.
And at the end of the episode, we'll get your stat for the By the Numbers section on this topic. So I'm looking forward to hear what you've picked out for us today. But why don't we kick off with a bit of the backstory? So most of our listeners are international. So can you talk us through a little bit about this case against Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and what exactly are the Epstein files?
Okay, I'll try to keep this somewhat organized, but it's a very disorganized story. And a lot of things happen. The first thing to keep in mind is that we are talking about events that occurred 20 years ago. We're talking about events between 2002 and 2005. And it started with Epstein, of course. And Epstein was a financier who cut a rather wide swath through New York City society. He used to go to a lot of functions, and he made a point. He was one of these people who always liked to be seen with important people. But there was also a dark side, Epstein, a particularly loathsome side, and that was predation on young girls. And he was initially charged in Florida due to complaints. Complaints were made against him for sexual misconduct towards young women as young as 14. And the state of Florida prosecutor's office looked at this and was taking steps to charge him. And as well, the United States attorney in Florida was looking at this because there were both state and federal aspects of this criminality. It was agreed, and this is not unusual, it was agreed between the state prosecutors and the federal prosecutors to turn it over to the federal prosecutors. The federal prosecutors brought charges against Epstein that have been highly suspicious to this day. Because while he was investigated and there was evidence to charge him with an enormous number of criminal acts, the prosecutor in Florida agreed with Epstein's lawyers and Epstein that Epstein would just plead guilty to 2 counts of soliciting prostitution And in exchange, Epstein agreed to a modest prison sentence, which he served. But, and this is what has been lingering in the background, is the United States attorney in Florida entered into a written agreement with Epstein, which is called a non-prosecution agreement, where it was agreed that Epstein was going to get global immunity from any other charges, and his associates would be given immunity.
Oh, wow.
He signed this as well as the U.S. attorney.
Wow. Huh.
Now we fast forward. Epstein served his time and got out and entered society. At this point, the U.S. attorney in New York City started looking at Epstein's conduct. And they recognized that maybe 1,000 young women had been trafficked by Epstein. A New York City grand jury was convened, and they filed an indictment against Epstein on many, many counts. Epstein was arrested after that indictment. He was denied bail and put in the house of detention. 30 days later, Epstein is dead.
Wow.
Whether the official report is suicide, not everyone has always believed that. Well, his death, of course, ended the proceedings against Epstein. But his partner, Ghislaine Maxwell, was thereupon charged as a conspirator with him for helping procure these young women. And she was tried and convicted and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. She has filed an appeal, which is now before the United States Supreme Court. Before we get to that appeal, I think I should answer your question about what are the Epstein documents.
Yep.
And there's really two categories, or maybe three. One is there is an enormous video file of child pornography and things like that the federal government seized. There are also tens of thousands of pages of FBI investigatory reports and documents. And beyond that, there are also the secret grand jury proceedings in New York, because grand jury proceedings are done in secret. So it's really those categories of documents that exist. And the controversy has been about releasing them to the public, because there has been a substantial public interest. And this interest goes back to before the 2024 election.
Yeah. So, because these files, this whole Epstein case, has been a focus of, conspiracy theorists and Trump's Make America Great Again base. How did Epstein become a thing that's been such a focus for Trump supporters for a long time?
Yeah, and you're correct. It really goes back to the Trump podcasters, more so than Donald Trump, who've been making this into a major event. And it comes about, talk about conspiracies. You see, Epstein, there were pictures of Epstein with lots of prominent people because he would show up at charity parties and things like that. As I said, he liked having his picture taken with wealthy people, with politically powerful people, with socialites. He liked that stuff. And he threw enough money around that he could go to those parties. And the podcasters, remember now we're talking about, this is all long before, these events happened long before Donald Trump was a political figure. Going back to 2002 to 2005. certain of these podcasters started into this, the Epstein files. There's this sort of this dark undercurrent of American society of rich and powerful people engaging in predation on young women.
Mm.
And Epstein was the mastermind who provided the minors to these rich and powerful men. And that this was this great dark secrecy. And the name they always would like to pick at, of course, was Bill Clinton.
Uh-huh.
And the fact is, Bill Clinton, like lots of other people, took free rides. Epstein had his own, I think, 737, Boeing 737 jet. It was a big plane. It wasn't a private jet. It was a big jet. And he used to, again, to ingratiate himself into society, because he wasn't a member of society, nor was he a member of New York's financial elite. But he had some money. And he would let people fly on his private plane. And this gets a little confusing, like Donald Trump. And that we know about because the pilots have to file logs.
Yeah.
And the logs have some of this information, but it never had information about the young women. It just had initials. So we don't know exactly who was on those planes. But from what it appears, and from what Trump has said, and I think from what Clinton has said, they generally took that plane to fly from New York to Miami, not to Epstein's private island where the misconduct occurred, or most of the criminal conduct occurred. But of course, in the storytelling by some conservative podcasters, all of that gets kind of jumbled up. And when Donald Trump ran for president, he made a big deal of transparency and that he was going to release the documents of some of these lingering conspiracy theories relating to John F. Kennedy's death, Martin Luther King's death, and Bobby Kennedy's death. But all of those men died in the 1960s, not in 2000, not in the 2000s.
Yep.
Well, it was a different story.
Yeah, and because when he took office again, he ordered an FBI and DOJ review of the Epstein case. This is one of the first things he did when he took office again. And the review found there was no client list, and it confirmed Epstein's death as a suicide. So why did then Trump promise he would release these documents? Then he releases them, and then these findings of the review led to a massive outcry.
Well, you've got to realize these documents undoubtedly contain thousands of names. That's how an FBI file works. Everybody, you could have been the person who delivered the newspaper to Epstein's office, and your name could very well be in the file. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong at all. But if it was you, you wouldn't really want your name out there because you're associated with Epstein. So the FBI has a longstanding policy that they do not release names of people who are just incidental or even worse, victims, the young women.
Yeah.
And a lot of the names are the young women. Yes, and Trump promised that he would release names. What has complicated, not names, but documents. What has complicated things was several months ago, at the beginning of the year, the new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, made the statement that the client list was sitting on her desk. Well, it's now been stated over and over again, there never was a client list. In fact, Epstein's own lawyer said there never was. He never saw anything like this. And why would there be one?
Yeah.
But you see, when someone like the Attorney General makes a comment like that, and there are people who believe there's some dark conspiracy going on, and now the Attorney General's office says, oops, sorry, there never was a client list. Well, you're fueling the conspiracy. Trump, in turn, says, and I don't know who advised him on this, that we'll release the grand jury testimony from New York City. The problem with that is, of course, it would never satisfy the people who believe there's something secret going on, because it's not everything. It isn't the FBI investigative files. It is just the testimony that went on in front of a New York grand jury, which is secret. But grand jury testimony usually doesn't provide that much information, because all it will have is a bare amount of testimony sufficient to get the grand jury to indict the defendant. The prosecutor does not show his whole case to the grand jury, because, see, although the grand jury is secret, Epstein's defense lawyers were allowed to see that transcript or to defend Epstein.
Has this process of, there's a FBI DOJ review into the investigation, and then they shared that review, and then Trump has said, okay, release the grand jury testimony. Has any of this followed the standard practices and procedures for handling, like FBI and DOJ handling of these sorts of investigations and what is made public, or has it been different to the norm in any way?
Well, there actually isn't a norm per se. It did up to a point. The FBI and DOJ reviewed the files, and they have issued statements to the effect that because of the need to protect individual privacy of innocent people, they have elected not to release documents. The president says, well, we'll release the grand jury testimony, but the president can't order the grand jury testimony produced. Doesn't have that power. Only a federal judge can do that. So what happened here, and it's just getting stickier for Trump, the attorney general went to the federal judge and said, we'd like to release the grand jury testimony. And the federal judge said no, and ruled against the government, saying this is filled with private details about victims and innocent people. You haven't shown me any reason. The fact that the president wants to release it is not a reason. That's now on appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals. The government's appealing that. But for the moment, they can't release the grand jury testimony. So that's kind of where everything stands now on the documents.
And in terms of Ghislaine Maxwell, you mentioned earlier that she is currently serving a 20-year prison sentence for her role in conspiring with Epstein. But then, recently the Department of Justice Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, he completed 9 hours of interviewing her. She was granted limited immunity ahead of these meetings. And there's been talk of, Maxwell angling for a presidential pardon of some sort. What do you think the DOJ is hoping to find out from talking to Maxwell that they don't know already from their investigations? And how credible is her testimony on these issues?
Well, as to her credibility, I don't know. I mean, I would suspect that it's perhaps somewhat questionable because she's trying to get out of jail. I should mention at this point, she has just filed the last documents with the U.S. Supreme Court, alleging that her conviction was unlawful, that she has to be let go. And it's because, and she may have a valid ground, because what happened is, I mentioned earlier, Epstein had entered into that non-prosecution agreement in 2007 in Florida, whereby the U.S. attorney said, if you sign this agreement, you're not going to be prosecuted for any of this stuff that happened between 2002 and 2005, and neither will any of your associates. And she was one of his associates. Epstein signed it, and the U.S. attorney signed it. Then the U.S. attorney in New York starts the whole thing all over again and charges offenses from that time period against Epstein, who's dead, and then against Maxwell. And Maxwell is saying, you can't do this. The U.S. attorney gave immunity or an agreement not to prosecute Epstein or any of his associates for this stuff. The government's response is, oh, that was the U.S. attorney in Florida who signed that. I'm the U.S. attorney in New York. I'm not bound by what the U.S. government agreed in Florida. Now, you can see where Ghislaine Maxwell has a legitimate argument before the Supreme Court saying, wait a minute, it's one United States government. If the U.S. attorney in Florida signs off on something, that should be binding in New York.
That's really interesting because it gets to the crux of what's been in a lot of the recent Supreme Court decisions is, how far can the powers of the federal judges, expand? Can they make a ruling, a universal injunction that blocks an executive order and applies to the whole country or not?
That's right.
It's interesting if her appeal is based on a similar issue, like the jurisdiction of federal judges. How far does that expand?
Had he lived, Epstein would have pressed the same issue because they entered into this non-prosecution agreement with him. And as it turns out, different courts in the United States interpret these agreements different ways. In New York, it just so happens that the federal courts do not accept that the agreements are binding in another federal district. In other words, if the agreement's made in Miami, it's good in Miami, but it's not good in New York. In other federal courts, they've taken the position of, no, it's one United States. And if the United States agrees to this, it's binding through the whole country. So it's really fortuitous of where it happens, how a court treats it. And so she's gone to the Supreme Court and said, you got to straighten this out. You can't have one federal law in New York and another one in Miami and another one in Dallas and Los Angeles. And it's dangerous to predict what the Supreme Court will do. They haven't agreed to hear the case yet, but I think they will. And she's filed her briefs. The government's filed its opposition. And now we await to see whether the Supreme Court will hear the case. They haven't agreed to hear it. But so there's major proceedings in the courts. And if I could interrupt things, this is where this feeds the conspiracy about Epstein's suicide. In that, why would a man commit suicide who has an extraordinarily valid legal argument of why he can't be prosecuted? Why would you commit suicide when you had that argument? And remember, he hadn't been convicted or even tried in New York. He had just been arrested. And this was a guy who had served a prison sentence in Florida. But this argument that Ghislaine Maxwell is pursuing is precisely the defense that Maxwell would have, that Epstein would have had he lived. And you can see why this creates, again, a cloud. And by the way, the U.S. attorney who signed that agreement in 2007 in Florida has himself been heavily criticized for entering into what many people have called a sweetheart agreement with Epstein.
Yeah, it seems like a very remarkably favorable outcome for Epstein. So that
unbelievable.
is
Unbelievable. The worst child predator perhaps in American history, and he gets to plead guilty to one count of soliciting prostitution from a minor and one count of soliciting prostitution in general, and serves 13 months in jail, in the local jail, in and out, going to meetings and still going to his office while he's in jail. And this agreement that neither he nor his associates will be prosecuted for anything else in this time period. But it was entered into, it was signed, and now she's going to test how far it goes.
Yeah, it'll be a really interesting case to see how that plays out. I guess the one topic I want to make sure that we touch on before we have to go relates to this defamation lawsuit. So the Wall Street Journal published a story alleging that Trump sent a letter with a crude drawing and a reference to a, quote, wonderful secret for Epstein's 50th birthday in 2003. And after they ran that story, immediately Trump filed a defamation suit against the newspaper and its owners, including Rupert Murdoch, for $10 billion US. So what can you tell us about this defamation suit? What is Trump alleging? And how strong of a case even is it?
Okay. Trump is basically alleging that they published a fraudulent letter that he never wrote, and that he told them before publication when they called him to ask him about it. And he said, I never did that. I never sent that. That's not mine. It's a fraud. They published it anyway. He sued for defamation. The fact is, in the United States, it is extremely difficult for a public official to maintain a lawsuit for defamation. Whether or not that letter was a forgery or real, that alone doesn't make for a defamation case. Even if Donald Trump shows that letter was a fraud, he doesn't win with that. Under American law, for a public official, and the president is the most public of public officials, he has to show by a very, very high standard of proof that the Wall Street Journal objectively knew it was fraudulent when they published it, or they had sufficient grounds to believe that it might be fraudulent, that they published it recklessly. And Trump has to prove that that was the mindset of the Journal at the time they published it. That's very, very hard to do. But there is another reason why public figures file defamation suits in the U.S. It is an extremely effective way of telegraphing to the public that this is a lie. And it is so much of a lie, I filed a lawsuit and I'm going to take these guys to court. And you throw in a number like $10 billion, which of course the media picks up on. So it's a big, big number. But you can kind of make that number up. I mean, and it is very hard. Most of those suits get thrown out by the courts early on because it's all the proof burden is on the plaintiff in the U.S., and Trump has to prove all of it. He's got to prove the letter. Trump has to prove that the letter was a forgery. Got to prove that. And then he's got to basically prove the Wall Street Journal knew it was a forgery or acted really recklessly, having knowledge with the state of knowledge they had. And again, he has to prove that with a very, very high standard proof, higher than in a normal civil case. Not an easy thing to do. But in the meantime, Donald Trump's made his point. That he's made it very loudly and publicly that this is a fraud. So that could explain. I don't know precisely why he filed it, but I would think that he wanted to make his point clear. But keep in mind, the real point is that whether or not the letter is a fraud, that alone cannot win a defamation case for a public official.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that there's just another legal avenue involved in all of this Epstein stuff. Although it's if Trump is using this lawsuit for the optics and the message that it sends, I wonder to what extent he's happy to have that increased attention toward that aspect of it, the Wall Street Journal story and his accusations against them versus some of the other storylines that are playing out, or whether he just wants all of it to go away. I'll be interested to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, and that's a good question of how long will the interest in this continue, because there really is a legitimate issue of, initially you might say, why doesn't he just release the documents? But the problem is the grand jury things we've already seen he doesn't have the power to do. And by the way, the FBI files, a great deal of those have been sealed by the courts in New York, again, to protect innocent people whose names just appear. Because the fact is that someone like Bill Clinton, and by the way, Donald Trump flew on that airplane 8 times. But what does that doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean you had sex with a 14-year-old because you took a free ride on somebody's private jet. But suddenly you're pulled into his web. And it's undoubtedly extremely embarrassing. And I've read the comments of any number of people, including people like Bill Gates, who apparently knew Epstein, where Gates basically said, I wish I had never met the guy. And I would suspect there's an awful lot of people in that category. I wish I never met this guy.
Wow. Well, that is a really interesting note to kind of sum up all things Epstein. Thank you so much for sharing your legal insights. I guess the last thing I'd love to hear is what statistic you've chosen for us today for your By the Numbers.
One that I think would be of some interest is how many times did Donald Trump fly on that Boeing 737 that Epstein owned?
Mm-hmm. Was it 8 times?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And that was primarily between New York and Miami?
Yeah, Trump said he never took that plane to Epstein's Island. And he seems probably very grateful at this point that he never accepted one of those invitations.
And more of the story is, be careful who you accept free plane rides from.
Look, there are people, a lot of creepy people who like having their pictures taken with prominent people. And I recall years ago when Frank Sinatra was dragged before a investigating commission in Las Vegas and confronted with photographs of him take it with some mobsters in New York City. And they said, how do you explain this? And he said, I was performing at a nightclub and these guys were introduced to me by the owner and they took my picture with them. I didn't even know who they were. He said, I never spoke to them. I never saw them again. They apparently were someone who knew the manager, and they take pictures like that all the time. And he said, I kind of wish I hadn't, knowing who they are. How this will play out, right? No idea. If it depends this is an unusual situation where the people who seem most anxious for these documents are among Trump's strongest supporters. Which you asked before, how is this different? That's how this is different. Usually the crowd asking for this stuff are people who don't support the person in power. They're looking for evidence. Here it's just the opposite.
Yeah, that's a very interesting dynamic that really does set this case apart in many ways. And it sets it apart from the other dynamics we've seen between Trump and his base and their undying support. But this really has sown some fissures in there, and it'll be interesting to see where this pressure goes. Does it die out? Does it culminate in something? That's what we'll be watching next. So as we wrap up, I would like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our listeners. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, hosts the Asia Chessboard podcast. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 Election Watch series. So you can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Harry, thank you so much for joining me today.